When it comes to listing some of the most successful Pontiacs in history, one of the vehicles that often comes to mind is the 1969 Pontiac Grand Prix. The 69 Grand Prix was John DeLorean's baby and an absolutely gorgeous vehicle. It took what was really a corpulent 1968 model that didn't sell very well and turned it into a muscular, athletic-looking vehicle that sold over 100,000 units in its first year. The Grand Prix was soon redefining the personal luxury car space, and other General Motors divisions, as well as other auto companies, became jealous of its success. It's for this reason that Chevrolet ended up introducing a rush-to-market 1970 Monte Carlo, which was equally, if not even more handsome in some cases, despite its rather hasty timeline for implementation and execution. And while the final execution of the 69 Grand Prix certainly was successful, it's kind of fun to examine this particular vehicle and see what might have been based on some of the designer's original sketches and clay models. And that's what we're going to do in this segment, is take a look at some of these sketches as well as clay models for the 1969 Grand Prix and see what might have come out and debuted. And you can put in the comment section if you think the final version of the car was more attractive and you would have bought it, or some of these proposals. Let's get started with some of these sketches. And here we have an early conceptual sketch of the 69 Grand Prix. Notice that it has hidden headlights and a very prominent nose, shall we say, similar to the arrowhead format that makes up the Pontiac logo. Of course, here you have some air intakes, and the grille is formed as part of this protrusion, I guess you'd call it, on the front end. The interesting part about this sketch is a few things. Well, first is that, as is typical, the designer here is kind of cheating the proportions of the overall vehicle. Notice the roofline is way lower than what it would be in production, and the sketch is construed such that the car is much wider than what it would be able to be in production. That was pretty typical. But an interesting fact about the sketch was that it was actually done by a designer named Don Hood, who would later depart General Motors for Chrysler and would be the lead designer in charge of the 1970 and 71 Plymouth Barracuda, some of the most dramatically styled Chrysler vehicles of the early 1970s. So Don Hood, before he worked at Chrysler, worked as part of Pontiac division, and this is one of his sketches. Moving on to the next conceptual sketch, we have one from John Perkins, who would later rise to become a studio chief at General Motors. You notice here that there's this similar pronounced beak on this particular proposal for the 69 Grand Prix, although I will say this beak is more like the bunky beak or Knudsen nose that graced the front end of the 1970 and 71 Thunderbird and even 71 and 72 LTD. So my guess is that this sketch was executed sometime around that time where Bunky was still around or had just departed for Ford Motor Company. And perhaps that's what Bunky brought to Ford, because it looks very similar. Although here, the grille is bisected in part by the bumper, which has some interesting horizontal lines in it. Not sure if I care for the headlamp spacing. It seems a bit exaggerated and strange, but an interesting proposal nonetheless. Here we have what I'd call a romantic proposal from a designer named George Camp, somebody who's extremely talented, spent some time in Pontiac studio and Cadillac studio as well. And you notice here that this is, I'll call it a romantic proposal for the 69 Grand Prix. It kind of has that four-fender look a little bit to it, and an interesting dropping belt line there forming the bottom edge of the glass. Now take a look at the front nose, and while the nose on this vehicle doesn't really resemble the final 69 Grand Prix, it does, at least in my mind, resemble the nose that would be employed on the 1973 version of the Grand Prix when that would come out. So while George's proposal wasn't necessarily used for 1969, perhaps some elements of it, at least the front end, would be employed on the 1973 version of the Grand Prix. And here we have a final conceptual sketch. This one was done by a gentleman named Don Logerquist, who was in Pontiac studio at this time, but Don Logerquist actually had a hand in many different General Motors vehicles, seminal General Motors vehicles. In fact, from this Grand Prix, as you can see here, and I have to say this is one of my favorite renderings of this front end. I just think it's got an overall dynamic flair to it, and I actually like how the overall form of the front kind of comes out and points forward, not just this particular nose section. So A really cool proposal here by Don Logerquist. But Don Logerquist would also be a key figure in the design of the 1966 Oldsmobile Toronado. And he would also be a longtime assistant in Cadillac Studio, working on a number of vehicles there. So Don Logerquist was really an individual who had a significant impact on GM styling across a number of divisions. Now let's transition to looking at some full-size clay models for the 69 Grand Prix. And recall that early in its development, the 69 Grand Prix was originally going to be taken off of the full-size car platform as it was in previous years, all the way back to 1962 when it was introduced. It was John DeLorean who really advocated for transitioning it to the so-called A Special platform, the smaller, more intermediate-sized platform that gave the car different proportions. But at this point, I believe these are proposals when it was thought that the Grand Prix was still going to be off of the full-size platform. And here you see some, well, strange, a strange clay model front end. Take a look at that grille, and you'll see that one of the things that is very predominant here is that chrome grille. And this is because Bill Mitchell himself, then General Motors styling vice president, articulated to the design team that he wanted the front end of this Grand Prix to look like the Miller race cars of the 1920s. And you can see that very clearly in the clay model proposal. The grille here on this 1969 proposal really emulates the grille on the Miller race car. That was one of Bill Mitchell's favorite vehicles overall, and it seems, from what I can piece together, that he directed styling teams not only to copy that Miller race car's grille form for grills on vehicles, but also even for the tops of the headlamp area on cars like the 1965 Cadillac and even the 1966 Nova. So it's just a consistent theme of his that you definitely see here. And one other thing I'll point out, while the headlamp area wouldn't make it through to production on the 69 Grand Prix, I think similar headlamps made it through on the 71 full-size Pontiacs. Obviously, the grille was different, but to me, the headlamp area here looks very similar to the 1971 full-size Pontiacs, for better or worse, kind of a love it or hate it look. Next, we have another full-size clay that, again, is likely executed back when designers thought that the Grand Prix was going to be taken off of the full-size car. And notice the nose on this particular proposal emulates the 1969 full-size cars, no surprise. I have to say, I generally love Pontiac styling, but that nose on the 1969 cars is one of my least favorite elements. It just looks strange with that loop bumper and kind of unfinished. It appears that on one side of the car, the designers are trying out the exposed headlights here on the passenger side, and then they're trying out the concealed headlights on the driver's side of this clay model. But I just don't care for that nose on the 1969 Pontiacs, and made even worse by the fact that that nose was made out of the Endura material that after all these years cracks, and then with the cracks it just looks even worse. But this is one of the proposals. And here's a dead-on front view of that same car. Notice again the exposed headlamps on the passenger side, the concealed headlamps on the driver's side. It looks like maybe on the passenger side, I can't quite tell with the lighting on the driver's side, that the designers are trying out this loop bumper, probably on both sides, just to see what it looks like. The nose here does have a form similar to that Don Hood sketch, but the point of the nose is much more acute here than it was in the sketch. I wish it had been spread out a little more. Overall, I think this is kind of a funny looking proposal to me, and glad that this one didn't make it through to production. And here I believe is the rear of the same car with a couple different proposals, or at least one side maybe looks a bit unfinished, but take a look at what designers were thinking here for the rear of the vehicle. I guess you'd call it like the surface that overlaps the deck lid and even to some degree the back window. It's, well, kind of strange looking yet again. The taillights are similar to what would make it through on the final full-size Pontiacs, but I would say not a handsome proposal overall, and that overlapping surface, at least to me, just looks a bit bizarre. So thankful it was not selected. Transitioning to a different rear end, we have this clay model here, which is interesting because of the taillights. Notice there are taillights in the bumper here, which isn't overly unconventional, shall we say, But there's also 2 high-mounted stop lamps on the Grand Prix. Now, for General Motors, the 71 Tornado would really be the car that would introduce those high-mounted stop lamps to the buying public, and the 74 Riviera would also have them. At Ford, the 1970 Thunderbird, I believe, had those tail lamps as optional equipment, but the 71 Tornado, 74 Riviera, they were just standard. That was part of the overall design. But as you can see here, designers were thinking about employing those even in 1969 on the Grand Prix. Not quite sure why it didn't make it through to production or why this feature transitioned over to Oldsmobile, but, well, could have come out on the Grand Prix a few years before the 71 Tornado. I will give you an interesting tidbit of something that the Grand Prix did set up for the 71 Tornado, and that is the door handles on the 69 Grand Prix are the same as what was employed on the 71 Tornado and even the Riviera. So the Grand Prix did donate some things to the Tornado eventually. And here we have one final proposal, well, a clay model on the bottom as well as a rendering up top. And you can see the clay model on the bottom is getting pretty close to the final production version. In fact, it looks almost identical. There are some differences to the rendering up top. Notice the rendering has a more steeply drooping roof. The roof kind of droops downward as it moves rearward. And the clay model also has that, which was very typical of GM cars during this time frame. It just wasn't as pronounced as the rendering. And the nose is a little bit different too in that rendering. The hood or the header panel droops down a little bit more before it forms the top of the grille versus what ended up in production. But overall, it's pretty close, and I think that rendering, the dash to axle, is also cheated. It just looks a bit extreme, and you can compare it there visually to the production model and see what you think. In any case, irrespective of those renderings as well as the clay models, I think the 1969 Grand Prix that made it on the road was actually the best choice of really everything that you saw. And the buying public, I think, would agree too, just based on the sales numbers. As I mentioned, in 1969, the car sold over 100,000 units. I think it tripled the volume of the 1968 model. So hugely successful and clearly set up the Grand Prix franchise for many years to come. The 69 and 70, at least of this body style, are my favorite. The redesign that came in 1971 and for 1972 with the single headlights and the pseudo boat tail rear as well, not necessarily my favorite, but I guess that was just in keeping with the style of the times. And the 73 Grand Prix, I kind of still like that one. I think that one aged better as the years went on, and probably my favorite versions of that are the 76 and 77 models, where they really got that arrowhead front, I think, down well, and the quad headlamps helped that particular vehicle too. But what do you think? Which of these Grand Prix proposals do you like the best, or do you like the production car the best? Put a comment in the comment section and let me know. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, take care.